Hello, everyone. Welcome to App from Scratch, where we will be learning how to build your dream apps from scratch. My name is Ingso Chen, and I will be your guide at App from Scratch to show you the processes. Okay, so the idea is actually very simple. That I have an idea to build of my app to build, so I'll build it, and then I'll show you how it's done. And by you learning how I do my app, you then go ahead and try to build your app with it. And we will do this in the Node.js environment. Okay. So the prerequisites for this particular module core, is that the assumption is that you already have either working knowledges of JavaScript or SQL, and then, or you have previously worked with other programming environment as a developer before. Now, while this is the assumption, it is not true that you definitely have to have these particular knowledges. It's just that within the module core itself, we will not be preparing you for the knowledge of JavaScript or SQL. We already assume that you have it. But we can have supplemental modules where, if you say, for example, helping you to basically brush up on your JavaScript knowledge, or brushing your knowledge on SQL, or any other things, any other sort of technologies that we'll be touching as part of the learning to build your dream app within the Node.js environment. So just let me know if there are any particular thing that we are working with that you don't know about, and if with enough people requesting for them, we will then be creating supplemental modules. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. And as we all know, building an app is very long, and basically it's like a marathon process. So it's going to take a while for us to get to where we want to go. And so it's always good to start with your idea in mind, start with what your goal is in mind. And since I'm going to show you how I'll be building my app, so let's talk about what my goal is. So basically, I'm actually building the site appfromscratch.com, which will basically host all the information that I'm showing here from scratch. Now, I actually had to do a little bit of a running ahead in order to get all the basic information that you will be seeing prepared for the demonstrate. So unfortunately, those weren't previously recorded, so I have to redo this part from the very beginning. And appfromscratch.com is going to wait until I have reached its current capability before I start to add additional enhancement to it. So for example, right now it does not have a commenting system, and we will not have a commenting system in the site until I show you how I built it. Okay, so that's the idea. As you are using appfromscratch.com as your app building learning platform, you will actually be watching this app building learning platform to be built from scratch. Okay, so that's my goal, and we'll start from the very beginning. We'll start from basically just, the assumption is that none of us here knows about how Node works, and we're gonna start from just getting one single line and written down, and then slowly grow that into the app that we want to have. Okay, so let's talk just a little bit about Node.js. Chances are you already know what Node.js is, so this is really just more of me just setting the stage. And if there's any really detailed questions, that is what this whole course is going to be about. We will be answering those specific questions along the way. Okay, so Node.js is a JavaScript runtime based on Google's V8, and this is meant specifically for writing backend applications, specifically like web applications. But obviously, people have been using Node for multitudes of purposes, so it has already outgrown its original purpose. And its claim to fame are two things. One is that it's based on JavaScript, so that way all the front-end developers were basically able to leverage their front-end skills, and then be able to tap into, try to grow their knowledge in the back-end development without a hassle having to learn another programming language. And as much as I would encourage everybody to try to learn multiple learning languages, I do understand the appeal and the big deal that it is for many people that they can reuse the knowledge that they already have for multiple domains. So, and that's definitely one of the reasons why Node.js is successful. And another reason why Node.js is successful because it focuses on asynchronous non-blocking I/O, which basically allow the server to be able to handle many more requests than it would be able to handle otherwise if the I/Os are blocking. And non-blocking I/O comes with its own challenges, so part of what we need to do is learn how to write code in the non-blocking I/O method. And finally, there's one additional thing that makes Node.js really popular, and that is NPM, which stands for Node Package Management. And basically, there are a lot of code that's written for Node, and it's made available through NPM for people to share code. NPM is claimed to be the biggest code repository in the world for any particular programming environment. So that just shows the level of popularity, even though not every single module there are of high quality, but it's definitely very easy for anybody to get started. And chances are that if you just spend a little time looking into the NPM itself, you probably will find something similar to what you're looking for, even though you don't always find exactly what you're looking for. So by leveraging NPM, you can actually help speed up quite a bit of your development speed. And definitely try to always check out the original documentation, Node.js. In the documentation in the Node.js environment is always somewhat terse because even today, it's actually somewhat expected that you'll be able to read the actual source code to be able to understand what the modules are doing. And so, for the uninitiated, it's actually kind of tough to get into it. And that's actually part of the motivations for this particular course anyway. So, but whenever there's any discrepancies at all between what I'm showing here versus what the Node.js versions or, as the version changes, I'm not necessarily going to be able to come back and update this tutorial. So always go off of Node.js own documentation as the final arbitrator. This program is just meant to help propel you along the way, so that way you'll be able to use them. So we'll actually, going to visit these few websites as we are going through this learning program ourselves. Okay. All right. So that is what Node.js is, and obviously that we can talk about it in abstract form, but there's nothing that will prepare us better to know exactly what it is by just go ahead and dig in to write our example. So obviously that's for the simplest examples. We know that is the hello world example. So let's try to write a hello world code in Node.js. So open up your favorite code editor and go ahead and create a file. Let's go ahead and name it index.js. And then we'll just go ahead and do a console.log hello world. And this is the simplest code that you could write in Node.js. Save it, and then let's go ahead and try to run it. So node index.js, and there we go. We have accomplished our very first goal of trying to print out hello world. Now this does it on the command line, and what we really want to do though is that given the fact that Node.js is really meant for us to build a web application, then let's go ahead and try to push beyond this, and let's try to write a hello world web server in Node.js. And the way to do it is in Node there are built-in made available modules, and the module HTTP is one of them. So to be able to include a module, the keyword in Node is called require. So define var HTTP equals require the HTTP module. Then after we've done that, let's then try to create a server by doing HTTP create server like that. And it takes in, as you can see here, request listener, which takes in it's a function that takes in two parameters, a request parameter as well as a response parameter. So then all we have to do is try to write out the data, try to print out hello world to the response. So this is our server, and then now let's try to make sure the server is listening to a particular port. So listen, and actually let's go ahead and create a variable called port, and we'll set it at 8000. So port, and this also takes in a few other parameters: port, host name, which is an optional thing, backlog, optional, even event listener, it's also optional, but I usually like to know whether or not that my listeners has been successful. So running server on port, and then let's see if there's an error. Okay. All right, let's save that, and now let's try to run it again. Node index.js. All right, so it says that the running server on port 8000 and undefined, which is what we're trying to print out on the error, and it didn't show that there's any error. So now let's go and see if we can now see our hello world. There we go. By going to localhost 8000, we can now see hello world is being printed up. And to verify that's actually what we're doing, why don't we just add a few more things here? Let's do hello world. Add from scratch is here. And let's restart the server. And if we go back to it, I'm going to rerun. There we go. Hello world, add from scratch is here. And then given the fact that that is our only handler, it doesn't matter what we're passing in here, it will always give us back the same information. This is a new URL. Okay, enter. Yep, it's just going to printing back the exact same information because that is the only thing that we asked it to do. Okay, so this is the simplest example that you can write as a hello world web server. And so let's take just a little bit deeper on what exactly it's doing. Okay, so as we said, the very first thing it does is that the very first line is that we're creating a HTTP variable, and we're assigning it to the HTTP module. And HTTP module is one of the built-in module that comes with the Node.js runtime. If you go to Node.js and you go to the docs, you will see that let's take a look at what is the current version of the doc, the LTS, which stands for long-term support. So if we take a look at that, then we can see down here there's an HTTP. Okay, so by default, Node.js environment comes with the HTTP module, and you just require using the keyword require to load the module. And once it's loaded, all the HTTP functionalities, which you can read through on the Node.js website, is available to you. And one of the most important thing that you could do, actually, assuming that you're trying to create a server, is that you can call the create server function. So let's take a look at that create server function by searching for it. Create server. There we go. HTTP create server. Okay. So it returns the HTTP server object, and then the request listener is a function by which that's added to the request event, which means that it's then going to be called back. Okay. And this is this is basically where the bread and butter of Node.js comes in. By using callback, Node.js handles I/O asynchronously. Okay, so instead of it being blocking, and it can be a little bit hard to see it just like this just yet, but the idea is this: when we create the HTTP server, we then listen for a request, and when the request occurs, then this function gets called. Okay, so this function is never called unless there is a request. So how do we know that's the case? We can do some server logging. So let's add a console log here and then say a new request, and then we can actually print out some variables, like say for example request URL. We can also print out the method which tell us whether or not this is a get event, a get request, or like say for example it may be a post request. So that's when we save that, then now we stop it. Let's try it again. Now when we run it, we can see that this line does not get printed at all. And then it gets printed when we come back here and we do a refresh. Now we can see here's a new request, and it's a get request, and then this is the URL that it's getting. So if we say, hey, let's get another URL that we haven't seen, okay, then it prints that out as well. So by some user trying to do a request against a server, then when the server sees that event, then it triggers that. So when it comes to the asynchronous, basically that is one type of asynchronous call, which is event. When users trigger an event, then the originally supplied callback will be called. Now there are other a lot of other programming environment at the very top level also handles it similarly. Basically, because so for example, even the simplest, not the simplest, even the most common GUI framework, it also goes off of, it's called event-driven programming. Basically, when user click on something, it generates an event, and then the developers writes code to handle those events and do whatever it needs to do. Okay, so the event-driven programming on its own is very, very prevalent in the rest of the programming environment as well. But what made Node different, at least when it first started, is that Node popularized the notion of doing every single part of I/O in an asynchronous fashion all the way down. Because for most of the other programming environment, after the original event callback is being triggered, the handling code itself is a synchronous call. For any additional I/O that happens inside, it's going to become a synchronous call. But in Node.js, that's not the case. Unless you explicitly try to do a synchronous I/O, by default, all the I/O are asynchronous. So to see exactly what we mean, let's try to do something. Let's try to read a file, for example. Let's try to create another script, and let's call this read. Okay. And in this read, what we want to do is that we want to basically read the file and then print it out. Okay. So first thing that we want to do is that we want to load up the FS module, and this is the file system module. And it's another module that's built into Node. Okay, so here's one thing to keep in mind. How do you know whether or not something is built into Node? In order to know whether or not a particular module is built into Node, you actually have to come to the Node documentation to see what are all the different modules available here. Okay, but you can tell there's different ways that you can see trying to require a file. So for example, we can require the original server file this way, the one that we wrote earlier, required /index, like that. Okay, and this is saying that this is a relative module. Okay, relative module based on the current directory, current files directory. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit more about what are all the different types of ways of doing require later, but for now, just to keep that in mind. Okay, so how do we read a file? Let's say that if we want to print out the index.js, how can we read it and how can we print it out? the way that we write it is like this. Read file, and then we probably should also load one more thing. Var path equal path, which is this is a path manipulation module in Node. And so what do we want to do? We want to do path join, which takes dir name with the underscore dir name is a special predefined variable that tells you the directory name of the current file. So it would know specifically when we're using this particular file, it would know that we are under this particular directory, C users, YC, projects, module core, or wherever this particular file resides in your code. And then we can then use that to say, okay, I want to take that directory information and I'll use that directory information to get to the particular file that we want to go to. So in this case, we want to load up the index.js file. And then one thing that we want to pass in for now is called UTF-8, which is the encoding for the particular file. And by passing it in, then we can ensure that read file returns us a string based on the encoding of UTF-8 instead of returning something called a buffer, which will require a different way of handling the code. So we just wanted to return UTF-8 for now. And now finally, it takes this, again, is the callback, the final piece. The third variable is the callback. Okay, and the callback is basically where the data is actually being returned. It returns it's callback that takes in two different variables. The very first variable is the error variable. Okay, and basically that you want to make sure you handle that error. You want to check whether or not it's null. If it's not null, then there's something wrong with the processing of that particular function. Otherwise, then you can try to do what you want to do with the results, okay, which is the second variable. So this is how you write the reading a file in Node.js. And let's just see it run. Let's go to the command line again, and let's see node read.js. Okay, and now it prints out this information, and this information is exactly the same information as our index.js. Obviously, that by printing it out on the command line is not going to be as nice as seeing it in the editor where the syntax is highlighted for us. Okay, now let's just say that if, for example, instead of index, we mistyped it as index2.js, which is a file that doesn't exist in this directory. And when we try to run it, then we can see that it throws an error. It says error occurred, error, and then it says no int. I think it stands for no entry. So which says no file directory. Try to open this particular file. Blah blah blah. Okay, so that's how you can see the error in action. You can, and then so this is where Node differs from other programming environment that we write code in async fashion. So for example, if we want to write it in the synchronous fashion, instead of writing like that above, we wouldn't have written the code this way. Let's comment this out. And which, by the way, this way, Node does also support some synchronous code, but you have to make sure that you do it yourself. So read file sync, and then we want to pass in the same function, same path I meant. And obviously index2 is a fake value, so let's remove it. Then we want to do it with the UTF-8 encoding. But instead of passing in a callback, we want to then return that as a variable up here. Okay, and then finally we print out the variable. So if we then run this function again, it would do exactly what we think that it's doing. And then if we, instead of passing in the right path, we're passing in the wrong path, then it's going to throw error out. But obviously that in that case, what it means is that if you want to handle the error, you have to put the code in a try and catch block like this. So if we run that, then we can see that we're now handling that error. We probably should add some additional code so we know that we're handling the error. Yep, we can see that handling error is not being printed out like that. So as a developer, obviously, there's no doubt that synchronous code is easier to write. Okay, it's a lot easier to write. And this is the reason why that for most of the other programming languages, they go with the synchronous I/O code by default. Okay. However, Node eschew that particular programming pattern, and instead of making the asynchronous pattern by default, because of the following reasons. One, JavaScript is single-threaded. Okay, so because JavaScript by default is single-threaded, and Node decided that they did not want to extend JavaScript runtime with multiple threads, then using, if we have a blocking I/O, then that means that all requests will be serialized if they have to be handled by a blocking I/O. Okay, so in some ways, because of the fact it's single-threaded, you basically have to use callback with asynchronous I/O to handle it correctly. But two, also at the time that this was designed, asynchronous I/O approach is shown to perform better because each particular thread takes up a certain amount of system resources. So you cannot have a lot of threads efficiently than you could have just doing things in an asynchronous I/O approach. Now, other environment, this is continuously getting better, so eventually this might not necessarily be true anymore, but at least during the time that Node was created, this was true. Now, finally, quite a bit of asynchronous programming actually comes from the browser. So this one of the reasons of people wanting to use Node is because they want to share code between the front end and the back end. So if developers have to write code for two different execution models for the front end versus the back end, then that reduces the attractiveness of Node.js. So Node.js basically try to make it so that way you can try to share code and try to program under the same programming model as much as possible between the front end and the back end. And so asynchronous I/O is the default way of doing things. And if you want to do work in Node, and also basically by extension inside the browser, then learning how to build asynchronous code is very important. And so we'll be doing that in here. We'll be basically getting used to how to write asynchronous code. And as we said earlier, there are two main type of asynchronous code. One type is something that's triggered by an event, and that is when users do something, event occurs, then you handle that particular event. But another type of asynchronous code occurred without an event, but it's just programmatically driven. So for example, you programmatically try to read the file, and so it's strictly speaking, you can think of that as here's an auto event. And then so therefore you have to handle that immediately. And so in this one, the default pattern is the callback pattern. Seeing with the FS module. And basically all of the Node standard modules supports the callback event. So there are additional ways of handling the code for the callbacks. So for example, promise, which we will cover in the future, is one way to make callback easier to write, because one of the interesting things about writing callback is that you cannot handle the next step until here. So if you think of it this way, it means that it's something like this. If I want to read 4 files, okay, let's just see if I want to read 4 files, then I have to write a code like this. Read the first file. Now here's reading the second file. So let's say reading the first file that exists, reading the second file, and now we're gonna read the third file here. And then now we want to read the fourth file. This is called the callback hell in Node. You can see that your code gets actually quite verbose, and it moves to the right, indents to the right very, very quickly. And if you have 100 such steps, then your code just all the way to the right, and you cannot see what's going on anymore. So people try to come up with the better ways of writing code, writing the asynchronous code easier in the future. But because all of the standard patterns in Node.js standard modules are all written in the callback method, so you have to understand how the callback method works. Just like you also have to understand how the event pattern works. Though chances are you probably already understand the event pattern, especially if you work with client-side JavaScript. I mean, actually, if you know any kind of pretty much any programming environment that you have worked in previously will have most likely have taught you about the event handling. So this is less of an issue. But callback is where that the new Node users usually get tripped up on. So for example, a lot of times when people are trying to write code, especially new developers, I made these mistakes a lot in the past as well, is that they keep on thinking in the synchronous fashion, but they forgot that they're writing asynchronous code. So for example, a lot of people would handling the error by throwing a try-catch block around the asynchronous call. Now, I mean, sometimes you might say, for example, instead of typing refile, you type in refile2, which is in the function. So in that case, you definitely make sense to catch this particular error. But you know, most of the time, that's not what new developers are thinking about. New developers are not thinking about handling the error of the non-existent function, instead of thinking about handling this particular error. But their mental model is that they want to handle the error in a synchronous fashion. So they thought that the handling occurs inside the try and catch block, and which is incorrect. In order you have to kind of for you to get used to handling the errors in the Node.js fashion, you really have to be able to get used to writing the callback code like this, and make sure that by convention the very first parameter of the callback is gonna be that error, and you have to check that parameter. Okay, so that kind of shows us what the asynchronous code looks like in Node.js. And chances are that as you are going to continue to follow my modules going forward, as you follow, you'll make this mistakes until you stop making them. So always come back to this section to look at how exactly you should write the asynchronous code. And obviously that I also try to do additional explanations as necessary. Okay, so let's then try to move that into, let's try to do one more thing as the last exercise that we will do for today's session. And that is that instead of just printing out hello world, we'll then try to integrate and load up the files in and try to print that out. So let's do require fs, and we'll require path as well. And since these are two of the modules that you will find a lot of use for, especially if you're writing file access code, pass join name, and then instead of doing that, we'll read back out the read.js file. So that way, in the read.js file, reading the index.js file, and in the index.js file, reading the read.js file. And then we do if err. Okay, so REST has this thing called status code, and let's take a look at what status code is. I think status code is a number. Yep. So we set this to a number, and the number will be 500, and then REST dot end, which stops the response as well as sending out whatever you sent it. So that we're gonna print out error, and then error stack, which will show us where the stack trace is. Otherwise, we will just print out the data of the file. And because again, since we're not writing code in the asynchronous fashion, we can no longer put that code, we can no longer put the next step after reading the file as in a synchronous fashion. We instead have to do it inside the callback like this. So let's save that and then run it again. Node index.js. And then if we go back to our localhost, now let's reload it. Now we can see that this file has been printed out. Now it's printing out, it's treating it as HTML, so that's the reason why that the new line no longer works. So let's set it to be treating it as text plain. So res add, I think it's headers. So set header. There's a lot of time that the nice thing about having a good source, a good code editor is that it can try to help you to do IntelliSense. So that way you don't have to remember as much of what all the different properties and methods that you have access to. So we set it to text plain instead. Come back here, kill that. Okay, now it's printing it out just like what we were doing, expecting a file. Okay, and then let's just test what happens when we read a non-existent file. When we save that, and let's restart the server. And now when we come back here, oh, it throws in there. So let's look at the error, and then looks like, what does it say? It says buffer.js. It throws a new type error. Encoding must be a valid string encoding. And then it occurs a from string, buffer from, create write request, socket write generic, socket write, do write, clear buffer. So it looks like what's happening is that we're probably passing in something incorrectly to the response. Oh, here it is. It's the second parameter to res.end, because I use a comma here, so therefore it treats what's following as a second parameter, and that's not what I meant to do. What I meant to do was put a plus right there, like that. And so the way that we would know it is that if we look at the response end, the first parameter is data, so the second parameter is encoding. So I had previously passed in the error.stack as the encoding parameter, and that's wrong. So by changing it to append, we will fix that problem. All right, let's try to rerun that again. Let's go back to here and reload. Okay, now this error is being printed out. Okay, so now we can see that the our very first small amount of code for our Hello World web server that's in place, and we are going to grow this Hello World web server into a full-fledged appfromscratch.com going forward. And obviously that as you watch how I do it, you will try to grow this into a full-fledged yourwebapp.com going forward. All right, that's it for today, and let me know if there are any questions.